Okay, now it looks like the number is stabilized. It always takes a minute for everyone to be let in, and when we turn on the spigot there, so looks like we've got a good number of people here. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lisa Austin, and I'm with MnDOT in the Community Connections Office in the Metro District for about another week. I'm retiring, and my last day is May 5th, so I'm excited to be hosting today as my last role as the chair of the Transportation Planning and Economy Council for the Center for Transportation Studies. Um, I'm going to do a few introductions and get us started. So before we do that, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the CTS Transportation Planning and Economy Council Research Council. Um, the CTS has a few councils with different topic areas that provide a way for transportation professionals and researchers or academics to get to know each other and exchange information and really stay up to date on the current transportation issues. Uh, uh, these events and others bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors. And we helped recommend direction for research and improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. And I can speak firsthand. I've worked with CTS for over 20 years and written several problem statements and been the technical liaison for research projects and participated in CTS events. And these councils are an excellent way to enhance research to make it more useful for practitioners. So I've been very glad to be part of this through my career. So with that, Sam, I think you've got information on the council's information on the screen there, and so that's a little bit about CTS. So today's webinar is called EV Infrastructure and Fuel Policy, Understanding the Transportation and Economic Impacts. The webinar will examine two current policy areas shaping transportation systems. One is electric vehicle infrastructure development, and the other is low carbon fuel standards. So now I'm going to pass it on to my very capable Vice Chair Paul Morris, who's soon to be the chair. He's co-facilitating today's webinar, and he's going to introduce himself and cover some more details and housekeeping items.
All right, thanks so much, Lisa, and welcome everyone for participating in today's webinar. We're very pleased that you're here. I'm Paul Morris, and introducing myself for the first time as the new statewide travel demand modeling director at MnDOT. So, as Lisa noted, bear with us as you have two MnDOT staff as leading this committee, but we all congratulate Lisa. She is looking at retirement here in the next couple of weeks, incredibly. So a couple of things just housekeeping wise for today. We look forward to a lot of questions and audience participation. The best ways that you can do that is using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. All of the hosts and panelists will be monitoring that, and that's a good way to get your questions answered sort of in real time. As the group, can respond to those. However, we also hope to reserve ample time for question and answer at the end, and so you can use the raise hand feature so that you can unmute yourself and then ask your question. This event does qualify for professional education credit here, and so we invite you to record that. There are also a significant number of upcoming events on the CTS calendar here. A couple of notable ones this spring that we'd like to draw your attention to is on May 19th. There will be another webinar for how infrastructure shapes driver behavior and pedestrian safety. And so invite you to visit the CTS website to take a look at that. There will also be a couple of in-person events on May 5th, and those will be hosted at the U of M's McNamara Alumni Center. There's the All Councils meeting taking place from 9 a.m. to 11:30, and then that's immediately followed by the annual awards luncheon and meeting here. So one of the highlights of the CTS calendar, to be certain. Lastly, we always want to give a special welcome to our students that are joining us today, and make sure you're recognized by the practitioners in the in attendance. So we invite you to put your name and email in the chat as a way to sort of announce yourself as a student here, and hopefully that could lead to some future networking opportunities.
Thanks so much, Paul. I'm going to be introducing our speakers, and before I do that, I want to make sure that I recognize Sam Hondeville and James DeSoto from CTS. They're really the brains behind putting these webinars together and really help things run smoothly and whatnot. So thanks so much to Sam and James. All right, so this webinar will discuss transportation policy and energy markets are evolving rapidly as states explore strategies to reduce emissions and support new fuel technologies. This webinar will examine two current policy areas shaping transportation systems, electric vehicle infrastructure development, and low carbon fuel standards, as I said a little bit before. So Beth Kallestad from MnDOT's Office of Sustainability and Public Health will provide an overview of Minnesota's electric vehicle infrastructure program. Her presentation will discuss how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and NEVI funding have shaped the development of EV infrastructure in Minnesota. She'll also cover the program's current status and what to expect in the next phase of implementation. After Beth's done, then we'll have Monica Haynes and Neil Wilmot from the University of Minnesota in Duluth. I grew up in Duluth, so it's great to have some UMD representation here. They'll highlight a 2025 study that examined the relationship between low carbon fuel standards, which is also LCFS, and gasoline prices. They'll explore how LCFS programs in other states have affected retail fuel costs and discuss the challenges of predicting economic impacts of potential LCFS programs in Minnesota. All right, so Beth Kallestad is the Sustainable Transportation Planning Director with MnDOT's Office of Sustainability and Public Health. Monica has served as the Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Minnesota Duluth since 2014, and she supervises a small team of student researchers and is a writer and an editor. And Neil Wilmot is an associate professor and head of the Department of Economics and Healthcare Management with the Leibovitz School of Business and Economics up at UMD. All right. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Beth. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's see here. Okay, and is my screen share coming through all right? Great, awesome. Well, thank you for having me. As you've said, I'm Beth Kallestad, and I'm with MnDOT's Office of Sustainability and Public Health, and I'm here today to share with you about the EV infrastructure work that we have been doing here in Minnesota, and we can have some conversation around that when I get done. And hang on just one second. Let's get an adjustment on my screen. Okay, there we go. And we've already kind of talked about what we're going to cover. So to begin with, why is MnDOT even involved in vehicle electrification? Well, we know that people, technology, and weather are changing, and that the best transportation solutions support health, reduce emissions, and strengthen Minnesota's future. And electric vehicles do all of these things, but for people to be able to drive and to use their EVs, they have to be able to fuel them. So it's important that we have that infrastructure in place. Before we dive into the infrastructure piece, I want to take a kind of higher level view and think about that Minnesota has long been a leader in identifying strategies to advance and make progress on our climate action goals. As a state, we've included targets for EV adoption in the statewide climate action framework, both the 2022 and the 2026 versions that just came out. We also have goals in our 2022 statewide multimodal transportation plan at MnDOT, and I would anticipate that will probably continue as we do our updates with that document this next year. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency took the lead on helping Minnesota to adopt the Clean Car Standard that brought more EVs to the different dealerships and purchasing options around the state. And then as MnDOT, as part of our statute 17401 that kind of gives direction for our agency, that does also call out increasing low emission vehicles and reducing greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. MnDOT as an agency has produced various plans and studies to address the roles of EV infrastructure and EV adoption and emissions reductions in Minnesota. And in our earlier work, the late 2019 is when our Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation report came out. That was a little bit more of a higher level view, and we have since progressed to more of an implementation focused approach. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Implementation Plan that first came out in 2022 for us, and then our carbon reduction strategy in 2023 were developed as part of that federal funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And those were very concrete, let's get these things done in these ways. And then we've also completed an EV infrastructure needs assessment in July of 2025. And that gave us, I would say, a broader understanding of the needs around greater Minnesota, where our initial iterations of the NEVI plan were a little more focused on our interstates, and I'll touch on that more in a little bit. So along with why we're doing the work, I think it's helpful for you to have an understanding of the status of EVs and EV chargers in Minnesota. EV and charger growth has been on a bit of a wild ride lately these last couple of years, but despite there are changes that have been happening at the federal level, some have made them more challenging to do this work, and others have made it a little bit easier. But I would say that EVs and chargers are alive, and while growth is changing, they are far from dead. So let's dig into that a little bit more. In the US, and I am by no means an economist, but a quick search tells me that sales of new EVs have been dropping lately. There was about a 28% reduction between Q1 of 2026 and Q1 of 2025. We know that the federal tax credits have gone away for new and used EVs, and I think that's definitely a driver in these slowing sales. However, while the new EV market is struggling, the used side is going pretty well. It was up between that same time period was up about 12%. So we see some opportunities there. Used EV prices are more in parity with gas vehicle prices. And unfortunately, right now with the war in the Middle East that's been going on, there are rising gas prices, and that may also be driving some of this growth. This graphic shows EV adoption in Minnesota between July 2023 and really just the end of 2025, very beginning of 2026. And we're calling EVs on the road. So this is the registered vehicle. So it's not new sales, but cumulative over time. And you can see here that it has been rising. We were seeing a little bit of a flattening at the end of last year, and we should very soon be getting the numbers for beginning of this year. We'll see what that's looking like. You can also just find more information if you're looking for data on the vehicles and charging infrastructure. There's a website put out by Atlas Public Policy called Evaluate Minnesota, and that is a good tool. We have a link to it on our MnDOT webpage. So right now we're a little bit over 1% of all cars registered in Minnesota are electric. Our statewide climate action framework goal, though, is about to be 20% by 2030. So it's definitely a room for growth and a goal that we may not meet, but it's good to have that goal out there. And one thing we found with our needs assessment work was that vehicle turnover is pretty slow. People are holding on to cars 12 years plus. And so while we would love to see that more rapid growth, it just really hasn't been in the vehicle turnover numbers that we're seeing right now. In terms of charging infrastructure, though, public chargers, we have both what we call level 2 chargers and the direct current fast chargers, or the DCFCs. This map is from the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center website, and that's a good source of information if you're looking for charging station data that you can download easily. That does have some good information. However, I will say it's not maybe 100% complete because stations do have to register on there, and there are some other tools that maybe have more information, but you can't get it easily. So if you're looking for data, this is a good source to go to. Anyhow, that being said, we are seeing growth both in direct current fast chargers and level twos around the US and in Minnesota, and both in numbers and geographic distribution. And I would highlight some new ones. Just when I went to look on this a couple weeks ago, there's a bunch in the northwest corner of the state. The utility over there, Otter Tail Power, has brought some stations online. We're seeing much more along the North Shore, and even in the more rural parts, west central, southwest Minnesota. There's definitely growth happening. So that is great. In terms of are they getting used? There's a website called Perrin that does some data analytics around EV charging station usage, and their numbers that I looked at showed about 7% utilization rate right now in Minnesota and about 15% nationally. So they are getting used, but it's still early days. All right, so now let's shift to talk a little bit more about what the planning work that MnDOT has been doing to help make this transition, because we know that people are very concerned about range anxiety, about running out of power, and it is a very legitimate concern. As an EV driver, I have had my share of experiences with this, and it's a scary thing not knowing if you're going to be able to get where you need to go. So we want to make sure that folks can make those long distance trips as well as the other work that they need to do. So we, as I mentioned, did this EV infrastructure needs assessment project between about March 2024 and July 2025. I think some folks on the call here today were part of different focus groups for that work. And the two main deliverables from that project were a report document that has sections that you can see listed out here, as well as a long distance charging analysis dashboard or tool. And we are using this to help inform our next rounds of investments with the NEVI formula funds, the charging and infrastructure grant program that my colleagues in our Office of Transit and Active Transportation have. And we are hoping that others will use this as well as they're looking at where might we site charging infrastructure around the state. And two couple important pieces from that work, I think, were that we broke down the different charging scenarios into three categories. So we're looking at long distance charging, more of a destination charging approach, and amenities. And these all serve different purposes and vary by power level of chargers, amenities, other factors. We developed some guidelines that can be used as recommendations by others when developing the charging. These guidelines are not requirements, but using them, we're hoping will bring some consistency in terms of a user experience and helping to support adoption. So we've been trying to help roll out these various tools and information for people to use. All right, so now let's talk about the funding, because we can't build chargers without there being some money to make that happen. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program, is really broken down into two buckets. There's the formula funds program and the discretionary funds, and both have gotten press in various ways lately. But the formula funds was, again, part of that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Initially was going to be $68 million to Minnesota over 5 federal fiscal years. That was recently updated. Congress chose to repurpose some of those dollars to a different transportation pool or funds. And so now for the NEVI program, we're at roughly 53 million over the 4 fiscal years. And that program really focuses on the direct current fast chargers with locations needing to have at least 4 charging ports at 150 kilowatts, focusing on our alternative fuel corridors first, which is I-35, I-90, and I-94. And again, that long distance travel focus. And it's managed through my Office of Sustainability and Public Health. The discretionary funds was a program that Federal Highways set up that was a grant program, so various entities could apply. MnDOT did choose to apply and was awarded some funding through the Charging and Infrastructure Community Grant in what was called the Round 1B effort that Federal Highways put out. We are calling that program the Greater Minnesota EV Infrastructure Community Program. And it's a total of $8 million for the project, but 6.4 coming to us as federal funds, primarily focused on level 2 charging infrastructure, hopefully about 42 sites. And it is more of a shared mobility locations focus, community travel focus and that's managed through our Office of Transit and Active Transportation. And I'll dig more into those in just a moment. To say where are we now? Um, so these charging stations, I forgot to say this in the previous slide, the NEVI funded stations that MnDOT is working on we are distributing that through a grant funds approach. And the stations can be on private or public property, but they are not in the MnDOT right of way. We do not own, operate, or maintain the station. So it's kind of a unique public-private partnership in some respects. We did our first request for proposal for this program in December 2023 and a second in fall 2024 along I-94, I-35, and then adding an I-90. Hopefully tomorrow we will have station number 3 open in Stewartville. It's very, very close. So that'll bring us up to 3 operational stations along with Burnsville and North Branch. And we have 5 sites under active construction, 5 more that are in the process of breaking ground. And let's see, that leaves us 11 more that we have gotten under contract and are in various stages of design and environmental review and all that. So it's going to be a busy construction season here for these NEVI funded stations. And then what's coming, oops, let's see here. There we go. So while we were doing all that, we were this past September able to use our the plan update that we submitted to Federal Highways to get $41.8 million of funding obligated, which is basically an agreement between MnDOT and FHWA that we're going to do this work. And we broke it out by our MnDOT districts and set a number of projects and a total dollar amount of projects around the state. These came through our EV infrastructure needs assessment report. We are doing a request for information right now to help inform that, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. You will notice there are no locations in the Metropolitan Planning Organization boundaries. A couple different reasons for that, but basically, some of it had to do with timing and just really wanting to help support more of the areas in greater Minnesota where we were less likely to see private investment happening. We will continue to focus on long distance travel with this, but looking at locations off of our US and Minnesota state highways. As I mentioned, we have a request for information open. We have 74 locations from that EVINA project that we've included, and we're looking at broader distances from the roadways than we did the first time around with the NEVI program. So a lot of the clusters can be up to 5 miles travel from the roadway instead of the 1 mile from the NEVI program initially. And we would love to get feedback on areas of interest for potential development and or constraints in these different areas we've identified. And maybe I can share the link later in the chat of this request for information in case anyone would like to submit something on that. And lastly, our timeline for this part of the project is close that request for information next week. We will then move into finalizing the request for proposal, hoping to get that out probably later in August. Hopefully then take about 2 months to receive applications and get to conditional awards by the end of the year. So that is the formula fund side of the house. And then I'm just going to touch a little bit on the Greater Minnesota EV Infrastructure Community Program. As I mentioned, that is mostly focusing on level 2 charging locations and then a little bit of funding in that for the DC fast chargers. And this is really a 2-phased project. So the initial part of the funding is a pre-construction, a planning effort, really. And the applicants for that part of the program are going to be considered program participants. So MnDOT is going to be using the funds that we have available, both through this federal grant and through a different funding opportunity to help really cover the costs to pay for some consultant work and support to help communities do some of the planning, environmental review, et cetera, that would be needed to then get to the next phase of construction. That phase 2 construction is they're hoping to be able to get that funding obligated shortly and move that along. But in the first phase, the applicants would be program participants. The areas of focus for this is actually kind of a unique thing. So these really include multimodal hubs or locations that can be shared use of chargers by fleets or other transportation services, rural charging locations, that includes a special carve out for the Iron Range, and in smaller urban communities, locations that could be used by residents of multifamily housing or predominantly serving low income, historically disadvantaged populations. And eligible applicants include tribal nations, municipalities, public transit agencies, electrical utilities, regional planning and development organizations. So again, a little bit of a different focus from the fast charging piece that talked about prior. And then it's definitely a partnership. There's three groups with this. So there's MnDOT, there's the program participants, and the consultant team. And the timeline for this, a webinar was just held the other day, and a recording of that will be posted. They're hoping to see applications from program participants launch soon, and hopefully we'll be able to get applications in. It's a much shorter application than the one for the Formula Fund, so hopefully everybody can get those turned around and submitted. We'll get those scored and participants selected, and then they can launch the program in the fall. So a lot going on, a lot of opportunities here in the charging infrastructure space. If you would like to learn more about any of these topic areas, dig into the EV infrastructure needs assessment, or learn more about either of the funding opportunities we have. This is a landing page for all three of those pieces of work. And last but not least, I have contact information here for myself and then my colleague, Michelle Kiley, who's managing the charging and fueling infrastructure funds. And I think with that, I will stop sharing and I can provide some links in the chat as we go along, I guess.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much, Beth. Wonderful presentation and great to see. I'm so glad there's pictures in there too. That really helps kind of bring it to life and show us that it's real, that there are chargers out there. We do have just a couple minutes. If anyone has any quick clarifying or technical questions on Beth's presentation, we can take those now. Feel free to raise hand or put them in the Q&A. So I do see a question from Michael in the Q&A here. He says, how are EV charging unit utilization rates being measured? Beth, is that one you can take verbally here?
I can try. That's a really good question. Karen, again, is the company that is doing that work. And this is where my understanding of the technology definitely breaks down. But there's some cloud conversations that happen. I think it has to do with their the software that Karen is using and the charging stations are talking to each other in some capacity, and they're evaluating station use. Exactly how that works, I'm not sure, but I will go look up the link to their webpage so you can try to learn a little bit more about them, and hopefully that might help to answer some of the questions.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Beth. Again, great presentation. And if anyone thinks of other questions, again, we hope to reserve plenty of time at the end for additional discussion and conversation here. So with that, we will turn to our next presentation. So Monica, you are welcome to go right ahead. And thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you. Okay, let's see here. Okay, all good? So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the session. I'm Monica Haynes, and I'm the director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Minnesota Duluth. A little bit about our department. The BBER conducts applied economic research for businesses, policymakers, and nonprofits on a variety of topics, including economic impacts, sustainability, workforce development, and today I'm talking about transportation. So I'm going to share some of the research that my colleague Neil Wilmot and I did last year on low carbon fuel standard programs and their impacts on gasoline prices. So first, just a little overview of kind of what I'm going to be touching on. I'm going to give some background first on how this study came to be, go through a little high-level overview of how low carbon fuel standards work in practice and where the programs have been implemented to date throughout the US. Then I'm going to share what we found in terms of the relationship between LCFS programs and gasoline prices. And then lastly, I'll talk more generally about some other things that transportation planners and policymakers might need to consider as they think about what a program like this could mean for Minnesota. So, some of you may know that the Minnesota legislature has been considering a bill to create a clean transportation standard. So just first, a quick note on the terminology, because as these programs have evolved over the years, the branding has kind of shifted from purely talking about regulating fuel to addressing broader transportation emissions. So, you can see the move from the term low carbon fuel standard to a clean transportation standard in Minnesota. But in the academic literature and most of the research that we were looking at, they're kind of collectively referred to as low carbon fuel standards or LCFS programs. So I'm going to be using those terms kind of interchangeably today. I just don't want anyone to be confused about that. A little bit of background first just on the legislation in Minnesota. The proposed bill was first introduced in the 2023-24 legislative session, but didn't advance. And that was primarily because of concerns about potential impacts on gasoline prices, and then the concerns about economic effects on rural communities. So it was reintroduced in the 2025-26 legislative session as House File 2847, and it's currently under consideration in the committee process. But when that initial bill stalled in the 2024 session, the Center for Transportation Studies saw an opportunity to do a small kind of targeted early study focused specifically on the relationship between LCFS programs and gasoline prices in other states where those programs have been implemented. So they felt that if the bill were to come up again in a future session, which now it has, having some additional information to provide additional evidence and inform conversations at the legislature would be helpful. So that was how this small study that I'm going to be talking about came to be. It was a partnership between Dr. Wilmot and me, as well as two undergraduate research assistants, Ethan Ion and Sam Shaw. And just before I jump into the data, I want to clarify that this presentation is really just a summary of kind of how the LCFS programs work generally and a synthesis of existing research aimed at helping to inform that policy discussion. And then after my presentation, Neil is going to follow up with some additional research that he conducted, which kind of built upon these initial findings. So first, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with these programs and how they work, I'm just going to do like a basic introduction to LCF programs generally. So first of all, in these programs, all transportation fuels from gasoline to diesel to electric and everything in between are assigned a carbon intensity value. So these CI values are determined by assigning each fuel type a fuel pathway based on their life cycle emissions. And states that have implemented these programs elsewhere sometimes have thousands of different fuel pathways depending on these unique combinations of life cycle emissions. So the pathways account for carbon emissions from the fuel's feedstock, whether it's growing crops or extracting crude oil, to their production. So that might be refining oil or creating biofuel, the transportation involved in the process, so transmission and distribution, and then the end use, so burning fuel in vehicles or electricity. And so then also each state program has its own CI reduction targets, which become stricter over time or more aggressive over time. And then finally, the state establishes a credit market that allows higher carbon producers to purchase credits from lower carbon producers. So each producer can choose how they want to meet the target. Some producers might just purchase credits, and others might change their refining practices to reduce their life cycle emissions. So there's a lot of agency in how producers can actually meet those targets. So this is just a visual example of what I'm describing from New Mexico. Their clean transportation fuel program was passed in 2024 and just implemented earlier this month. So as you can see in the figure, the state requires a 20% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030 and a 30% reduction by 2040. So that's the dotted line in the figure. And these reductions are compared to a baseline, which in the case of New Mexico was the state's average CI or carbon intensity level in 2018. So under the new law, transportation fuels like electricity and biogas generate credits because their carbon intensity is significantly lower than the baseline and lower than the current reduction target, whereas higher carbon fuels like gasoline and diesel would generate deficits. So to meet the target, those producers, the fuels that are generating deficits, would have to reduce their own carbon intensity or purchase credits from the lower carbon producers. So in our report, a lot of the focus was on the potential impacts on gasoline prices, but given the topic today of the webinar, I also wanted to talk about the fact that some players in the market are going to be getting paid in these scenarios. So they're earning credits, they're earning revenue. So, kind of thinking about who's paying and who gets paid in these types of markets. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but generally petroleum refiners, gasoline or diesel importers, and high CI fuel producers are the ones who would earn deficit, therefore end up paying. But on the other hand, there are stakeholders that would receive credits in the market, and these include biofuel and ethanol producers, including corn and soybean farmers, EV infrastructure holders who provide the electric charging networks, and transit agencies. So any kind of transit municipality that operates electric bus fleets, they would also earn credits under these scenarios. So as of today, these are the LCFS programs that currently exist in the US and Canada. California was the first state to implement this type of program. Their bill was passed in 2011 and the program went into effect in 2013. So a lot of the literature that exists and research that has been done to date is on California's program. All of the other states that have passed similar legislation have been Western states or provinces like Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, and British Columbia. But there are a handful of other programs currently being considered in other states. So that includes New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. So again, I mentioned the Minnesota legislature introduced their House File 2847, Clean Transportation Standard, in the 2025 session. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that bill specifically and kind of how it relates to some of the existing programs in other states. So in most ways, it's very similar to the other programs that exist elsewhere, but there are a few unique differences about Minnesota's legislation that bear mentioning. So first, the bill sets a short-term target of a 25% CI reduction by 2030, which is similar to most of the other states' targets, but a long-term reduction target of 100% by 2050. So if the bill were passed, that would be the most aggressive long-term target of any state. The bill also incorporates credit price caps, so that is designed to protect against credit price spikes, and that We'll see in a second. There have been some instances in California's market where there have been periods of very high credit prices. So this bill is designed to avoid that. The bill also exempts aviation fuel, but allows sustainable aviation fuel producers to opt in to generate credits. So this kind of protects the aviation industry, but also encourages the development of a sustainable aviation fuel program in the state. And then finally, Minnesota's legislation explicitly includes credit premiums for soil healthy farming practices, so it encourages more sustainable farming methods. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot a bit and actually start talking about the research and the academic side of things. But it's kind of a complex, these programs are kind of complex, so I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So first of all, I want to touch on kind of what are the components or factors that influence gasoline prices, and what does the evidence say about how LCFS programs have impacted prices in other states where they've been implemented. So first, when you think about the factors that influence the price you pay at the pump, the biggest factor by far is the price of crude oil. So other price inputs are taxes, distribution and marketing, and refining, but crude oil represents more than half of the price of inputs for a gallon of gasoline. So in this visual and kind of thinking about these different categories, where does an LCFS program fit in? So any costs or revenues that stem from these types of programs would be incurred before the fuel reaches the gas station. So they would be felt at the producer level or at the wholesale level. So most often they're going to be bundled into like refining costs, but they also act kind of like a variable tax because it is a tax, but it fluctuates based on the market credit rather than being a fixed tax rate that producers pay per gallon or something like that. So this means that if a refiner blends, say, 10% ethanol, their refining costs might go up slightly because of blending logistics, but their LCFS costs, the variable tax might go down because they generated credits. So it doesn't fit really cleanly into any one of these buckets. And it kind of touches a little bit on all of those factors. So there are three levers basically built into these programs that can potentially influence gasoline prices in their own way. The first one is the carbon intensity deficit, and that's just the difference between that CI target established by the state and the carbon intensity value of a given fuel. So if the gap between those two is very large, then the cost to the producer to meet that goal might be more expensive. The second lever is the credit price. So the price of the credits is determined by the LCFS credit market, and it fluctuates all the time depending on how much fuel is being produced by different players and how many credits are being produced by the EV chargers. And so that's always changing and will depend on kind of supply and demand. And then there's the last factor, which is the cost pass-through. So if production costs go up, either because of these larger deficits or higher credit prices, then the question is how much of that cost does a producer pass through to consumers at the pump? So the first category is pretty straightforward. It depends obviously on those fuel pathways and what the target is, but it's pretty, it's kind of a constant, and it's not going to change a lot from day to day. Whereas the credit price and the cost pass through, there's a little bit more wiggle room with those. So I'm going to talk about each one here separately. So this figure shows the average credit price, which is in red, for California's LCFS program since it started in 2013, along with the monthly retail price of gasoline in the state during the same period. So what's interesting about this graph, which you can see just from looking at it, is there isn't a very strong relationship between the two factors. So when credit prices were spiking between 2018 and 2022, the price of gasoline was actually dropping slightly. And then when the credit price began to come back down in 2023 and 24, gasoline prices were increasing kind of sharply. So this just goes to remind us that the LCFS credit market is just one variable in a big picture gasoline prices. So during that period, 2018 to 2022, we were seeing COVID, supply chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine, instability, shifts in global demand. All of these things were affecting retail gasoline prices way more than any of these state level policies. So there are some that argue, we found a paper by the Kleinman Center from 2024 that credit prices so far haven't had much influence on gasoline prices because California's reduction targets to date have been pretty manageable. So they haven't been very aggressive. So therefore, credit prices have only applied to kind of a small share of the overall emissions from gasoline and diesel. And these authors are arguing that as the credit or the carbon intensity reduction targets become more aggressive, there will be a stronger relationship between credit prices and gasoline prices. And I'm going to come back to that argument just in a second. Okay, so the second factor, cost pass-through, a lot of the debate and literature around the impacts of these programs centers on how much of those increased production costs are absorbed by fuel producers versus how much is passed through to consumers. Or, on the other side, if switching to lower carbon fuels results in cost savings, how much of those benefits reach consumers in terms of lower fuel prices. So the research in this area generally suggests that higher costs are typically passed on to consumers, whereas cost savings are not. However, the exception is that in more competitive ethanol markets, like in the Midwest, the cost savings are actually passed through more fully, which benefits the end consumer. So there is some reason to believe that the Midwest market, which is very ethanol rich and has a more competitive ethanol market, there might actually be benefits to consumers here that wouldn't be as prevalent in the Western states. And then just one final note on this, I want to note that most of the literature on cost pass-through assumes that switching to lower carbon fuels will increase production costs. But as the price of renewables continues to drop and becomes more competitive with gasoline, then just generally compliance costs are going to be lower. Okay, so just a handful of articles actually attempted to quantify the price impacts from LCFS programs specifically. One was a report by the California Air Resource Board, and they cited third-party research that suggests that the price increase from the LCFS program to date was between 8 and 10 cents per gallon. So not nothing, but compared to the price fluctuations that we see just in a given day or week or month, relatively small. The only empirical study that has been done to date was done by Bates and White in 2022, and they found that 90% of the price variance in the cost of gas was explained by crude oil, taxes, and California's cap and trade program, and that the impacts from the LCFS program was not statistically significant. So that, again, kind of lends some evidence to say that the impacts generally from these programs might not be as large as some fear. So lastly, there have been some future-looking models that attempt to predict price increase price increases based on California's future CI targets. So these studies tend to predict much larger price increases, and some up to $1.50 per gallon. But these are based on future-looking models that assume 100% cost pass-through and very high credit prices. So credit prices of $200 per metric ton. So they really should be thought of as like a what-if scenario based on these very high-end assumptions. And in reality, in California, they just imposed some stricter amendments to their LCFS program that did require some more aggressive CI targets, and their credit prices have actually remained very stable even after those stricter targets. Mostly that's because of a large supply of renewable diesel that they've had in the state and an uptick in EV adoption. So those things have created enough supply of credits that the price has remained fairly low. So to summarize, if Minnesota were to pass the Clean Transportation Standard, what are some of the potential impacts? From what we found in the literature and just generally looking at these programs, it does seem that LCFS programs introduce some new compliance costs for traditional fuel producers, but the costs tend to be small compared to, the overall price of crude and other major inputs. And producers can choose kind of how they want to mitigate those costs. So they can meet their target in whatever method works best for them, whether that's blending with lower carbon fuels or changing other aspects of their production practices or just simply purchasing credits. And then in terms of the impacts to consumers, estimates suggest that California's LCFS program increased gasoline prices by about 8 to 10 cents per gallon. And in the Bates and White study, the impact was statistically insignificant when trying to predict prices. As compliance costs grow, the cost to consumers may increase, but California hasn't seen the massive credit price spikes that many have predicted because of that increased supply of biodiesel and EV adoption. And also Minnesota's bill has some of those credit price caps kind of built in to manage volatility. And finally, a lot of stakeholders through the state would actually benefit from the program. So farmers, EV charging companies and infrastructure holders, and transit networks that use electric vehicles. And then finally, there is some evidence to suggest that in the Midwest, where there is a more competitive ethanol fuel market, consumers might be more likely to see the cost savings from that market than Western states. So thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work, and also just want to share, if you are interested in the work that we do at the BBER, you can follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Monica. Great job. Appreciate you sharing that here.
Yeah.
We did have a couple of questions come in through the chat here, but as I look at those, I think they are a little bit more involved, sort of technical discussion questions, and so I propose that we hold those for the Q&A afterwards here. So I'm going to invite Neil to go ahead, and you may share your screen and begin. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Paul. I will just work on sharing. All right, so hopefully now you can see that and hear me fine. All right, as mentioned, I am Neil Wilmot. I am a faculty member here in the Department of Economics at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I guess I would I'm happy to be going after Monica because obviously I was involved in the study, and I think she did a great job of sort of setting the stage with sort of what the fuel standard was all about. And I'm gonna sort of take that as a jumping off point, steal one slide actually, and then think about or explain to you where I went with this study in a little more detail. So, as she mentioned, right, this is joint work with her and students from the BBR. So, let me step back for 1 second and provide a little bit of context. We've kind of specifically talked about sort of the legislation that has passed in California and Minnesota's role and expectations and such here. But in the broader context, right, if we think about the emissions that are being experienced, greenhouse gas emissions that the US are producing, right? This slide, I think, puts into context sort of the importance around those emissions coming from transportation, right? Specifically, you can see that in 2017, right, there was an important event, right? The emissions from the transportation sector across the United States surpassed those of the electricity sector, right? Demonstrating that we really do need to focus on the emissions that are occurring in the transportation sector broadly if we hope to meet a lot of these targets that we have put in place, we being states, we being the federal government, right? To meet those targets, we're going to have to attack those emissions in the transportation sector. And so really that's sort of the context where a lot of this has been occurring. With that as the backdrop, and then the information that Monica presented, and here I'm stealing her slide directly, so thank you, Monica. Sort of the idea, the framework that I had in mind as we did this project was this sort of mixed bag of evidence, right? So the California Air Resource Board suggests that there is an increase in the price at the pump that consumers are going to pay, right, of 8 to 10 cents per gallon from this LCFS program. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is consumers pays higher prices, right? But then juxtaposed to that, we have this Bates and White study, right, which suggests that the much more of the variance comes from, obviously crude oil, right, and taxes and other sorts of programs, and that the LCFS itself was not actually statistically significant, right, in increasing the price at the pump, right? And that's two different ideas, two competing ideas, right? So in that light, in that context, right, what can we say? Is there a way in which we can empirically come up with a way to sort of analyze this question and come up with a cleaner answer, right? And so that's kind of the context in which this research sort of evolved. So obviously there's a lot of research in the economics literature around gasoline prices, crude oil prices, right? The linkages between the two and all sorts of things. But I picked out a couple here that I think are the most relevant to what we're talking about that are fairly recent work, right? The first comes from a paper in the Energy Policy Journal, right? That looked at sort of this clean fuel standard idea, right? It examined the potential for a national clean fuel standard in the U.S. and the expectations of that clean fuel standard to drive cost-effective emissions reductions in various segments, including road and aviation, right? And so the authors argue that achieving this sort of net zero will require the complete phase out of fossil fuels, right, coupled with offsets to reduce emissions in other sectors, right? So they're arguing for the importance of this type of program and its usefulness in driving down those emissions, right? A second recent article from Huzanov and Holma, right, utilize empirical methods to ask the question: Has CO2 emissions in the California transportation sector been impacted by the introduction of this LCFS standards, right? And so they're examining sort of the data to say whether or not we see an emissions reduction, right? And so their argument, or what their evidence suggests, is that there has been a reduction in the carbon's emissions due to the implementation of this LCFS program, which is good in the context of let's try and reduce emissions, right? Their examination of the emissions market, right? What I am interested in, right, is sort of the price at the pump, right? What if it is the case that this program is driving up costs, right? Then maybe we can find a way to demonstrate that empirically, right? And I'm gonna skip over this slide because a lot of it Monica covered already, so I don't really need to go too deeply into that. From my perspective, right, we know, or building on what Monica told us, right, we know California adopted it. We know Minnesota was interested in it, but Minnesota has not yet adopted it, right? So that's also an important piece of information for where I want to go with my study. This is a similar graphic to the one that Monica also presented, right? So again, a breakdown of gasoline prices, right? Again, crude oil being the large component here. There's some differences in our percentages because hers was from 2024, our mine's from 2025, right? And you can see that that has changed a little bit. Refining costs have gone up, right? But overall, right, crude oil still dominates the input side of the price at the pump, and that's not surprising, right? And it's probably not surprising that a lot of the variation you see in the price at the pump comes from crude oil and the volatility that we experience in the crude oil market. Somebody mentioned the Middle East, ongoing conflict in the Middle East, right? That's currently going, and we've seen oil prices rise, and we've seen a subsequent increase in gasoline prices at the pump. So we're all familiar with that. That's not surprising. Another important paper that has examined, what is driving prices at the pump. This is obviously sort of pre-introduction of the clean fuel program, right? But these individuals looked at the lower 48 states and found that changes in the price of crude oil was really the only major factor contributing to the price variations in gasoline. So even though we know that there are other factors, right, generally a lot of the taxes haven't changed or don't change that significantly, right, or are tied to a percentage of the price, so that they're factored in, right? Refining, right, depends itself a lot on the price of crude oil. So again, not that significant. It is that price of crude oil that's driving it, which is interesting for what we're trying to do here. All right. She also talked about this, so I'm going to skip over that as well. All right, so let's get to the data and talk a little bit about how we're going to come to this sort of test of relevance. So what I have here is sort of a time series of retail gasoline prices in 3 different locations, right? We have the price in California, we have the price in Minnesota, and the price in the US as an average of all 50 states, right? So you can see, right, they're obviously highly correlated, right? They move together over time. They appear to be very similar, right, in the early 2000s, right? And then there seems to be more of a gap, right, in the later period of time, right? But when oil prices spike, right, then you can see that there's also, right, or world events or great recessions, right, there's also a corresponding spike in gasoline prices. So they tend to move together, tend to be highly correlated, though there is some differences in that as well. So thinking about that, right, what I'm interested in examining, right, is this idea that if California adopted the program, we know they adopted the program, but if it impacted prices at the pump, and we know that Minnesota didn't adopt the program, right, can we see that there is some change in the relationship between the two, right? And similarly, right, but to a lesser degree, right, maybe there's something with the U.S., right? It was mentioned that other states have adopted this, so that's probably not going to be as clean, right? I'm going to look at it purely from the perspective of the difference in those prices, right? And so that's really what we're interested in. Examine the relationship over time and think about whether or not there's been some sort of structural break, and then does that break align with the implementation of this clean fuel standard? Okay, and so there's a couple of different ways of doing this econometrically, right? A big part of this, since it's a time series analysis, has to do with the idea of stationarity, right? And so step one in the analysis would be to check whether or not these price series contain a unit root or do not contain a unit root, right? Or are they stationary? Are they not stationary? And then based on the result of that, right, then other methodologies could be used to examine whether or not there has been a structural break, right, within that relationship or within that series itself. And that's really sort of the second piece. Right? So in order to do that, we've got data on gasoline prices, right? I'm just going to mention one quick thing with this slide, right? This, if you look at this beige-ish line here, it tends to be the case that gasoline prices rise during the summer and fall during the winter. So there's some seasonality in the data, right? And so in order to account for that, we're going to work with de-seasoned data, right? And so here's how are we going to do that? We're going to standardize the data. We're going to utilize the standardized residuals, basically de-seasoned data. That's the easiest way to think about this. All right, so then utilizing that de-season data over the period from 2000 through 2024, right, what we find, thinking about the unit root tests, which are a test of stationarity, is that it tends to be the case that the gasoline prices of the standardized residual gasoline prices are non-stationary in levels, right? And so when you find that they're non-stationary, one of the ways in which you can station it, you can remove the unit root and make the data stationary is by differencing the data, right? And so that's what this second piece of the chart represents. We can, if we work with first differences or returns, if you want to think about it in that way, then we have stationary. This is important because if the data is not stationary, then you can get sort of erroneous results, spurious results, right? And it causes, a lack of confidence around the results. So we want to make sure that it's stationary so that we apply the right tools to assess this, okay? So there is a unit root, that's important. It is non-stationary, and we can difference it, right, to make it stationary. So based upon that, we're going to look for a structural break in the data, right? And so you can actually perform a unit root test that has the structural break built in, right? And so if I focus in on the California series itself, right, then what we see is that, yes, there is some significance of a structural break, right, in around July 2014. Okay, there is some corresponding evidence of a structural break in the other series, right? So if what I'm thinking about is, does the specific LCFS cause this break? This isn't necessarily clear evidence of that, right? And so um, a, a break is valuable, but maybe there's something that's happening unrelated to California that's affecting the other markets at the same time. Yeah. And I apologize for this table. I ran out of time to pick out the one I wanted to pick out. So it's sort of the broad swath of all of these tests combined together here. But what I want to draw your attention to would be sort of the bottom part of the table, where what we're looking at is the relationship between California and Minnesota. Since they are both non-stationary in levels, right, that allows you to perform what's known as a co-integration test. There are co-integration tests that allow for structural breaks, right? And so again, that's what I'm interested in here, thinking about, is there a potential structural break in the relationship between the Minnesota prices that did not experience the introduction of the LCFS, right, and then the California prices that did, right? And it does appear that in those series, particularly if we look in this one here, right, there is statistical significance of the test in this 2014 window, right? And so it doesn't exactly align with the 2013 period of time, but certainly there's likely to be some learning as that standard takes root and is imposed on the system, right? So potentially there's something there. Potentially, right? It potentially we might be capturing something else, right? If I look at California and the U.S., right, those breaks tend to happen with in later time series, right? Though there might be something happening on the Minnesota side, right, that we need to be careful about. So we don't quite yet have clear evidence of that break being significant. So there are a couple more things, and I should have started out by saying this is very much a work in progress. So it's not published yet. It's not completed yet. We're still working on the analysis, right? As we go through here, perhaps there are other ways in which we could modify it. And so I'm happy to take feedback. I would say that in doing this research, there are some potential delays to the adoption of this, right? So as you would expect, the environment we operate in, there tends to be court challenges when new policies come into effect. And so there was some delay of some legal action here. And so maybe that means that our 2014 structural break might be more appropriate to the 2013 implementation of this, right? So future work there would be to sort of dig into that a little bit further and think about the implications of that, right? And then one piece that I have not yet included, right, is a lot of what we're saying is the implication of the price of the pump depends a lot on crude oil, right? And I haven't yet implemented that piece, right? A lot of the crude oil literature involves using time varying volatility methods, right? And so there's a little bit more that needs to be done to incorporate that into our analysis, to think about eliminating the potential for any sort of influence from that crude oil driving sort of the break here. You wouldn't, stepping back and just thinking about it broadly speaking, it's an input into the price in both California and Minnesota. So we're not thinking that necessarily that is going to be something that is driving, but it also introduces different sort of empirical techniques that might be valuable in sort of the examination of this potential structural break. So I know I've gone over my time, so I'm going to stop sharing there and open up.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Neil. Well, that was a lot to get through in a short amount of time here, so appreciate you hustling along. But we certainly are excited to have some questions here. So I want to jump right in. And as I noted before, there were a couple of questions that came in the chat while Monica was speaking. So I'll just go right in. Jody is coming from a transit background and asked, what, if anything, happens if the bill is passed, but the 100% target is not met by 2050?
Yeah, I saw that question. As far as I know, there is no like penalty or stick or anything to but at least in California, from what I understand, they're actually exceeding their targets in terms of the reduction. So I think they're actually ahead of their targets and they implemented even more aggressive targets. And I think they are, meeting those. So that's not to say, obviously Minnesota, like I mentioned, has the more aggressive long-term goal of 100%, which is a totally different ball game. But yeah, as far as I know, there's nothing built into the bill that would penalize, anyone in particular.
Okay. Well, I think a related question we got from Andrew here is, doesn't the cap and trade in California effectively subsidize the cost of the LCFS program? So offsetting or hiding the cost to consumers at the pump.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And, it is something that I was thinking about, when you think about that Bates and White study, which says basically 90% of the impacts are coming from, either crude oil or taxes or the cap and trade. I had the same thought that the cap and trade, might be kind of masking those impacts of the LCFS program, but they were implemented at different times. So, I'm not sure. Neil, maybe that's something you can add into your analysis.
Yeah, something we could add in, something that we could certainly should really think about, I guess. But I know I haven't personally thought too much about that yet. And I think it would take some doing to think about sort of the multitude of effects and interactions, right? And so, but yeah, great point.
Good. Well, we always want to come away with additional research ideas here. So good to keep those coming. Monica, one of the other things that comes to mind, and this occurred to me kind of during your remarks as well, is because you mentioned the California actually being ahead of the schedule of the original legislation. Has there been research kind of predicting the consumer behavior response to these policies in terms of the extent to which it would accelerate adoption of other vehicle or fuel technologies relative to like business as usual?
Well, I mean, one of the explanations for why those credit prices haven't increased as much as feared is because, well, one, because of the biodiesel, there's a lot of biodiesel be entering the market to generate those credits and, a lot of producers that are generating biodiesel. But then I think, EV adoption has increased in California in large part probably because of some of these policies. And, so I don't know of research specifically that it has connected those dots or really, shown consumer behavior changes. But it does seem like, California, like Neil showed, has higher gasoline prices than the US on average. And so that would probably explain
Mhm.
some of that increased EV adoption.
Yeah, very good. Okay, we do have a hand raised here. let's give Alex a chance to ask his question. Let's see, Sam or James, can you unmute Alex, please?
I think he may have been raising his hand accidentally. He wrote,
Oh, okay.
sorry, in the
Nope.
chat, so.
No problem here. Well, we certainly welcome any other questions. Sam or James, do we have any other hands raised at the moment?
No other hands, but it looks like we do have another question in the Q&A.
Very good. So Michael asks, how is electricity rated in terms of carbon intensity with an LCFS? Does it take into account the intensity of the fuel source used to generate the power?
Yeah, my understanding is, yes, they really look at everything from, all aspects of the life cycle. And, you can actually go online and see those different fuel pathways. There's actually established kind of systems that states can adopt, different models that they can adopt for how they're establishing those fuel pathways and calculating the carbon intensity. But like I said, there's in California, I think they have thousands of different pathways. So if you're an electric fuel producer, maybe you are producing from a coal burning plant, that obviously would make your carbon intensity higher, whereas, other producers might be producing from more renewable sources. So yes, I think from what I understand, they take that full life cycle into account. And even, if you're thinking about like petroleum refineries or diesel refineries, they can adopt, different types of clean, renewable options just in their production beyond just, biodiesel or bioethanol. They can, take into some of those other factors to reduce their carbon intensity.
Great. Thanks, Monica. Any other hands raised or open questions here at the moment? No? Well, I had one more question that came to my mind during Beth's presentation and also kind of related to Michael's first question. Are you aware of kind of an industry target in terms of the optimal utilization rate for EV chargers? And I'm thinking there's probably some sweet spot between, making sure it's getting enough use to cash flow, the capitalization on that, but also, making it attractive for drivers that, having some confidence they're going to find an available plug.
I would say we have not delved into that yet, but yeah, it's absolutely true. We want to find a situation where we have enough capacity when it's needed, and especially, um, at times when people are trying, like if we do have some sort of emergency situations, trying to make sure that that is out there. We did in our EV infrastructure needs assessment look at trying to have enough public charging capacity to meet some of the climate action framework goals for vehicle adoption. And we were looking at, I think it was around 4,000 DC fast charging ports and like 40,000 level two. There were big numbers in terms of numbers of ports, and that wasn't even to get to 100% vehicle adoption. So it's there's a lot of room for growth, and I think yeah we we'll have to see what the utilization ends up looking like. But so far we're not too worried about long lines yet in Minnesota. That will be a good problem to have if we get there.
Yeah, that's right. I can't say I've ever seen a lineup at the chargers.
Not much.
Yeah.
There could be in a few places, but yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, I see we're at time here. We did get one more question in the Q&A, and I think this would probably be directed to Monica. So, Monica, I'd invite you to maybe respond to that latest question just with a typed response. And then meanwhile, I'm going to hand it back to Lisa Austin to lead us in our wrap-up activities. So thanks again to all our panelists today.
Yes, thanks to all the panelists. What an interesting topic and very important as we look to the future. So thanks everyone. Now we're at one of my favorite points in working with the research councils, and this was a little more effective when we were in person, but it's a chance to network and learn from each other and find out what issues you're facing in your organization. So it's a little round robin session. If anybody's got anything they'd like to share, whether it's a current transportation issue that you want to talk about, something that might lead to a problem statement in the future, or if you're have any information about your organization or event that you want to share, or any topics for future council meetings. So please raise your hand and we can unmute you and let you share. So round robin and networking. Well, I already shared my update. My last day is here on May 5th, so that's me. It's been interesting to try to wrap up and pass on my projects to other folks. I'm feeling good that I'm leaving things in a good place with everything I work on at MnDOT. And Paul announced his announcement that he now works at MnDOT, so that's exciting. Any CTS updates that either James or Sam want to share, other than the events we shared at the beginning?
I think that'll do it, although it looks like Elliot has just raised his hand for an update.
Yay, thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Lisa. Elliot McFadden with Minnesota DOT. We have a couple of events coming up that might be of interest to people. We're having a Minnesota Transportation Access Summit, which is going to be at the Capitol on June 2nd. So that's looking at how really focusing a lot on, especially communities of seniors and people with disabilities, but public transit and voucher-based transportation. And then the following day, if you haven't had enough of that, at the university in partnership with CTS, we're having the Shared Mobility Collaborative Summit, which is the first statewide shared mobility summit in Minnesota.
Oh, that's very exciting. I was involved with some of that shared mobility earlier in my career, so it's fun to see that practice grow. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right, we got 1 minute left. Any more? Nothing's happening at anyone's organization. That's interesting. Well, if no one else has any updates, again, I just want to thank everyone. It's been a pleasure to serve on the CTS Transportation Planning Council and to have worked with CTS over the last 20 years on various research projects and things. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good luck, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.